The dust was a living thing, a choking shroud that clung to her, a gritty veil between her and the merciless sun. Each breath was a rasp, each step a monument to an agony that had long since burned through fear, leaving only a hollow, echoing exhaustion. Her feet, raw and bleeding inside boots that were more holes than leather, stumbled on the cracked earth. The horizon shimmered, a cruel mirage of water and solace in a land that offered only thorns and stone. She had no husband, no name she dared speak, and no home but the one she fled. Then, through the haze of her own failing senses, a shape emerged. A line of fence, weathered silver, then the stoic silhouette of a windmill, its blades turning with a slow, mournful creak, like a dirge for lost hope. And then, him. He stood near a trough, a figure as weathered as the landscape, his stillness a counterpoint to the trembling that racked her frame. He did not move as she collapsed, a broken doll pitched into the dirt a dozen yards from his well. He simply watched her, his face unreadable beneath the brim of a stained hat, his eyes narrowed against the glare, like a hawk assessing fallen prey. When he finally moved, it was with an economy of motion that spoke of long acquaintance with hardship. He brought water, not in a delicate cup, but a dipper, cool and metallic, pressed to her cracked lips. She drank, a desperate, animal greed, the water a shock of life, a temporary reprieve. He said nothing. Words were a currency she no longer trusted, a weapon that had been used against her too many times. His silence, for now, was a strange, unreadable space. He lifted her, not gently, but with a surprising strength that was efficient rather than tender, and carried her not to the small, sturdy cabin she'd glimpsed, but to the barn. The scent of hay, dry and sweet, and the animal warmth of some unseen creature, enveloped her. He laid her on a pile of clean straw, covering her with a rough, woolen blanket. It smelled of dust and horses, but it was a shield. He left a canteen of water and a hunk of dark bread beside her, then retreated, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. She lay there, listening to the wind sigh through the ill-fitting boards of the barn wall, a sound like the world breathing its sorrow. Her hand clutched the small, worn satchel at her side, its contents the only tangible link to who she had been, or perhaps, who she was trying to become. Sleep was a treacherous country she dared not enter fully, but exhaustion pulled her under, into shallow, restless waves. Hours later, or perhaps minutes, she startled awake. The barn was dim, shafts of late afternoon sun striping the dusty floor. He was there, at the far end, mending a piece of tack, his movements deliberate, his presence a solid, unthreatening weight in the space. He did not look at her, yet she felt his awareness. Her heart hammered, a wild bird against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body was a leaden anchor. He finished his task, hung the leather strap on a nail, and then, without a word, left the barn, closing the heavy door with a quiet thud that felt more like protection than imprisonment. She watched the sliver of light beneath the door, a prisoner of her own fear and his inexplicable, silent charity. The bread was dry, but she ate it, the rough texture a grounding reality. The water was life. Days bled into one another, marked by the sun's passage and his quiet routines. He would leave food and water near the barn door. Sometimes, a piece of fruit, a welcome shock of sweetness. He never tried to enter while she was awake, never spoke beyond a low murmur to his horse or the few chickens that scratched in the yard. She began to venture out when he was far in the fields, a wraith flitting to the well for fresh water, her eyes constantly scanning, ready to bolt. The land was stark, a canvas of browns and ochres, stretching to distant, bruised mountains. It was a harsh beauty, unforgiving, yet possessed of a fierce, unyielding spirit that mirrored something deep within her. One morning, beside her usual provisions, lay a pair of boots. They were old, women's boots, scuffed but well-oiled, the leather supple. Stitched neatly along one side was a small, faded patch, a starburst of once bright thread. They were too large, but her own were disintegrating. For 2 days, they sat there, a silent offering. On the third morning, her feet aching and blistered, she slipped them on. They felt foreign, solid, a strange comfort. She saw him glance at her feet later, from a distance, a flicker in his otherwise impassive gaze, before he turned back to mending a fence line. The act felt like a word spoken, a bridge tentatively offered across a chasm of silence and mistrust. She started to help, in small, almost invisible ways. Sweeping the dust from the porch of the cabin before dawn, leaving a bucket of fresh water by the door, tasks he would find completed without witness. Once, her sleeve slipped as she reached for a fallen rag, revealing a puckered, angry scar that snaked up her forearm, white against her sun-darkened skin. He was nearby, coiling a rope. His gaze rested on it for a breath, a fleeting shadow in his eyes, then moved away. He said nothing. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with unspoken things, a shared understanding of pain, perhaps. He found a tear in the thin fabric of her dress, near the hem, snagged on a nail. The next day, he left a needle and a spool of dark thread with her food. She mended it carefully, her stitches small and neat, a skill learned in another life. The small, worn satchel remained her shadow, always within reach. Its weight was both a burden and a comfort. Inside lay the fragments of her shattered past, the reasons for her flight. The wind picked up one afternoon, a low moan at first, then a rising howl. Dust devils danced across the barren flats, harbingers of a greater fury. The sky turned a sickly yellow. He strode towards the barn, his movements urgent. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, yet clear. Cabin safer, it was the most he'd spoken to her. Fear warred with a nascent trust. She clutched her satchel, her knuckles white. He didn't wait for her agreement, simply held the cabin door open, his body a shield against the stinging grit. The cabin was small, one room, meticulously clean. A stone hearth, a simple table, a narrow cot. It smelled of wood smoke and him. The storm raged outside, a screaming banshee, rattling the shutters, shaking the very foundations of the small dwelling. Inside, the silence returned, thick and charged. He built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She sat on a low stool he indicated, as far from him as the small space allowed, the satchel in her lap. He did not look at her, but busied himself checking the window latches, the door bar. His presence, so large in the confined space, was not threatening, but strangely reassuring, like the solid stone of the hearth. The silence stretched, broken only by the storm's fury and the crackle of the fire. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken words, with the weight of her secrets and his stoic endurance. He moved to the small shelf above his cot and picked up a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. He turned it over and over in his calloused fingers, his gaze distant. She watched him, a pang of something akin to understanding piercing through her fear. This man, too, knew loss. The bird was smooth, worn by touch. A memory given form. The storm outside began to lose its ferocity, the wind's howl diminishing to a mournful sigh. He placed the bird back on the shelf, his movements precise. He looked at her then, a direct, steady gaze. "You're safe here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a question, but a statement. A promise. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny, fragile seed of belief began to sprout in the desolate landscape of her heart. The satchel felt a little less heavy in her lap. The uneasy peace of the following weeks was shattered by the distant thud of hooves, a sound that sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. It was different from the rhythm of Elias's lone horse. This was the measured, confident beat of several riders, approaching steadily. She froze by the well, the bucket slipping from her grasp, water splashing dark against the parched earth. Elias, mending a harness near the barn, straightened slowly, his head tilted, listening. His eyes found hers, and in them, she saw a flicker of grim recognition that confirmed her deepest fears. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his head towards the barn. "Hide." She didn't need telling twice. Scrambling into the shadowy interior, she burrowed deep into the hayloft, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the satchel clutched to her chest. Peeking through a crack in the boards, she saw them, 3 men, led by one with a silver star glinting on his vest. The sheriff. He was younger than she expected, with a face that might have been handsome were it not for the cruel set of his mouth and the coldness in his pale eyes. He dismounted with an arrogant air, his spurs jingling, a sound that seemed to mock the quiet industry of the ranch. Elias met them in the yard, his stance deceptively relaxed, yet rooted to the earth like an old tree. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice level, no hint of welcome or fear. The sheriff's gaze swept the yard, lingering on the cabin, then the barn. "Morning, rancher. Name's Calloway." Just marking some routine inquiries, his smile didn't reach his eyes. Looking for someone, he described her, not by name, for he wouldn't know it, but by a string of brutal assumptions: a runaway, a thief, a woman of loose morals. Each word was a lash against her hidden skin. "Seen anyone like that passin' through?" Elias shook his head slowly. "Ain't seen no strangers. Just the wind and the dust, Sheriff." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "This is a big, empty country. Easy for someone to get lost or be hidden." He took a step closer to Elias, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "Some folks are mighty keen on keeping what ain't theirs, or protecting those who don't deserve it." The threat was veiled, but palpable. From her hiding place, she saw Elias's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I tend to my own business, Sheriff. Expect others to do the same." The air crackled with unspoken challenge. One of Calloway's men, a brutish fellow with a scarred cheek, snickered. Calloway held Elias's gaze for a long moment, then shrugged, a theatrical gesture of dismissal. "Just doing my job. We'll be checking the area. If you see her, you send word. There's a reward." He swung back onto his horse, his men following suit. "We'll be back," he called over his shoulder, the words a clear promise, or a threat. They rode off, their dust trail a fading stain against the vast sky. She didn't move until the sound of their hooves had completely vanished, until the silence of the ranch settled back, heavier now, tainted. When Elias came into the barn, he found her huddled in the hay, trembling. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat on an overturned bucket a few feet away, his presence a silent anchor. The fear was a living creature inside her, clawing at her throat. Images flashed through her mind: a man's heavy hand, a locked door, the desperate flight into darkness, the terror of pursuit. The satchel seemed to burn against her skin. It held the truth, the damning evidence of her stolen liberty, a few precious items she'd salvaged from the wreckage of her life. A faded daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes, her mother. A small, pressed wildflower, a memory of a time before. And papers, official-looking, that spoke of ownership, of bondage, not by law but by a cruel man's will. She had thought them her shield, but now they felt like a target. Elias broke the silence, his voice low. "They won't find you here." It wasn't reassurance, it was a statement of intent. He rose and went to a sturdy wooden chest in the corner, one she hadn't paid much mind to before. He opened it. Inside, nestled among old blankets, lay a rifle, its wood dark and oiled, its barrel gleaming faintly in the dim light. He checked its action with an practiced hand. He wasn't a violent man, she knew that instinctively. But she also saw in the set of his jaw, in the quiet intensity of his focus, a deep, unyielding resolve. He would protect this place, his sanctuary. And now, it seemed, he would protect her too. Later, as dusk painted the sky in hues of purple and blood orange, she found him by the corral, watching his horse. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying a chill that had little to do with the dropping temperature. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath. She saw him touch the carved wooden bird on the cabin shelf earlier that day, his expression distant, tinged with a sorrow that resonated with her own. He had his own ghosts, this silent man. His own reasons for valuing solitude, for understanding the need for refuge. The sheriff's parting words echoed in her mind, "We'll be back." The threat was no longer a distant shadow, it was a tangible presence, looming over them, over this fragile piece she had begun to find. The boots he had given her felt sturdier now, more like her own. The days that followed were taut with a quiet dread. Every distant sound, every shadow that lengthened too quickly, sent her heart leaping. Elias moved with his usual measured pace, but there was a new alertness in his eyes, a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. He reinforced the barn door, checked the perimeter fences with more than his usual diligence. He was preparing, not for a storm of nature but one of man. She found herself watching him, not with fear but with a growing, reluctant admiration. His strength was not in words, but in the steadfastness of his actions, the quiet integrity that radiated from him like warmth from the sun-baked earth. He asked nothing of her, but his silent expectation that she remained safe was a powerful force. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows, she finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy from disuse, yet carrying the weight of her unshed tears. He won't stop." Elias was cleaning the rifle by the dim light of a lantern, the metallic click of its parts a counterpoint to the cricket's song. He didn't look up. "No. Men like that don't." His voice was flat, devoid of surprise. He knew. He had always known, or suspected, the nature of the shadow she fled. "Why?" she whispered, the question addressed as much to the uncaring sky as to him. "Why are you doing this?" He finished assembling the rifle, the action smooth and sure. He looked at her then, his gaze direct, holding hers. Some things a man's gotta stand for. The simplicity of it, the stark, unwavering conviction, left no room for argument. It was a code etched into his very being, as much a part of him as the lines on his weathered face. The sheriff and his men returned sooner than she expected, appearing at dawn like specters materializing from the morning mist. This time, there were 4 of them, their faces hard, their eyes cold. Calloway didn't bother with pleasantries. "We got word, rancher. Reliable word. You're harboring a fugitive." His voice was like gravel. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin, unarmed, but his presence was a bulwark. "She's no fugitive. She's a guest on my land, your land." Calloway laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This land will be yours for about 5 more minutes if you don't step aside." He drew his pistol, his men fanning out, their intentions clear. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was in the barn, hidden again, but the thin wooden walls felt like paper against their menace. This was it. The end of the line. But then, something shifted within her. The terror was still there, a frantic bird beating its wings, but beneath it, a new feeling stirred, a stubborn, defiant anger. She thought of Elias, standing alone against them, for her, a nameless, homeless woman. She thought of the boots, the mended dress, the carved bird, small acts of kindness that had stitched together the tattered edges of her hope. She would not let him face this alone. As Calloway took a threatening step towards the cabin, a distraction was needed. Her eyes fell upon a pile of old, dry kindling and a rusty pail nearby. An idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her mind. While the men's attention was on Elias, she slipped from the hayloft, heart pounding. With trembling hands, she stuffed some kindling into the pail, then, finding a discarded flint and steel Elias used for the forge, she struck a spark. It caught, a tiny flame, then another. Smoke began to curl upwards. She pushed the smoking pail towards a stack of old, dry hay bales near the back of the barn, far from where she'd been hiding, but visible from the yard if one looked. Then, she screamed, a sound of pure, feigned terror. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" The shout cut through the tense standoff. The men, even Calloway, turned. Smoke was now billowing from the back of the barn. "What the—" one of them yelled. Calloway hesitated, torn between his prey and the sudden threat of a blaze. In that moment of distraction, Elias moved. He wasn't aiming for a fight, but for de-escalation, or perhaps containment. He lunged, not at Calloway, but at the nearest deputy, disarming him with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of long-forgotten skills. The deputy yelped, his pistol clattering to the ground. She used the continued confusion to her advantage. She burst from the main barn door, not the side where the smoke was, screaming again, pointing frantically. "Help! The horses!" The lie was plausible. Elias had 2 geldings in their stalls. The ruse worked better than she could have hoped. 2 of the men, their greed perhaps momentarily outweighing their orders, or simply reacting to the ingrained fear of losing valuable livestock, broke away and ran towards the barn. Calloway, furious, cursed. "Fools! It's a trick!" but the diversion had given Elias the precious seconds he needed. He now had the deputy's pistol. He didn't raise it to shoot, but its presence changed the odds. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of iron. "Your business here is done." Calloway's face was a mask of fury. He saw his advantage slipping. He glanced at the barn, where his men were now realizing they'd been duped, then back at Elias, who stood firm, the pistol held loosely but ready. He looked at her, standing defiantly in the yard, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing. He saw not a frightened rabbit, but something else, something resilient. With a snarl, Calloway lowered his weapon slightly. "This ain't over, rancher." "And you," he spat at her, "I'll find you." But his threat lacked its earlier conviction. He motioned to his remaining man, and to the two now emerging sheepishly from the barn. They regrouped, mounted their horses, their retreat far less confident than their arrival. As they rode away, Elias quickly stomped out the small, controlled fire she had started. It had served its purpose. The smoke cleared, leaving the scent of burnt hay and the silence of victory, however fragile. She stood trembling, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her weak. Elias walked towards her. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze searching hers. He saw the soot, the fear still lingering, but also the spark of defiance that had saved them. He bent and picked up the deputy's pistol, then his own rifle from just inside the cabin door. Then he looked at her, a long, quiet look. "You were brave," he said, the word simple, yet profound. She shook her head, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I was terrified. Bravery ain't not having a fear," he said, his voice softer now. "It's doing what's right even when you're shaking in your boots." He glanced down at the sturdy boots she wore, his boots. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind a raw, echoing quiet. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to their struggle, illuminating a yard scarred by the confrontation but still standing. She had not just hidden, she had acted. And in that act, something had irrevocably changed. The dust settled, literally and metaphorically. The immediate, heart-pounding terror receded, leaving an echoing stillness. Elias moved with a quiet purpose, checking the barn, ensuring the small fire she'd set was truly extinguished, his movements betraying none of the turmoil that must have churned within him. She watched, still trembling slightly, the taste of soot and fear in her mouth. He came back to where she stood, his gaze lingering on her face, noting the tear tracks through the grime. He didn't speak of the sheriff, or the fight. Instead, he gestured to the well. "Water," he said. It was a return to basics, to the elemental needs that governed life on this harsh land. As she washed her face and hands, the cool water a balm, he retrieved her satchel from the barn, where she dropped it in her desperate bid to create the diversion. He held it out to her, his expression unreadable. She took it, her fingers closing over the familiar worn leather. This time, instead of clutching it to herself, she hesitated. Then, with a deep breath that was more a ragged sigh, she unfastened the clasp. "My name," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear in the vast silence of the ranch, "is Lily." It was the first time she had spoken it aloud in so long, it felt foreign on her tongue, yet also incredibly, liberatingly real. A name, her own. Elias nodded slowly, as if accepting a precious, fragile gift. "Lily," he repeated, the sound soft, natural. He didn't ask for more. But she wanted him to know. She sank to the ground by the cabin wall, the satchel in her lap, and slowly, carefully, drew out its contents. The faded daguerreotype of her mother, whose gentle eyes seemed to offer a silent blessing. The small, pressed prairie rose, a brittle memory of a brief childhood joy. And then, the papers. Not ownership papers, as she had feared Calloway might claim, but marriage lines, binding her to a man whose name she spat out like poison, a man whose cruelty had been a relentless shadow over her existence. And another document, painstakingly forged, a letter of manumission from a distant, fictional aunt, granting her freedom, a desperate, hopeful lie she had clung to during her flight. "He said I was his property," she whispered, the words choked with remembered pain. He hunted me because I defied him, because I took back the only thing I truly owned, myself. Elias listened, his silence no longer a void but a deep, empathetic space. When she was finished, the story laid bare like an open wound, he finally spoke. Some men, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, ain't fit to breathe the same air as a good horse, let alone a woman like you. He then looked away, towards the distant mountains, a muscle working in his jaw. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter. I had a sister once. Sarah. He paused, the name hanging in the air. Man like that, took her smile first. Then her spirit. Then her life. The admission was stark, brutal, a glimpse into the wellspring of his own quiet sorrow, the source of his fierce protectiveness. It was a shared grief, a bond forged in the crucible of loss and injustice. Lily looked at him, truly seeing the depth of the man behind the stoic facade. He was not just a guardian, he was a fellow survivor. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The sheriff did not return. Perhaps Calloway had bigger fish to fry, or perhaps the story of the quiet rancher and the defiant woman had given him pause. Or perhaps, Lily dared to hope, her abuser had finally given up the chase, deeming her lost to the vast, uncaring wilderness. Lily stayed. There was no formal invitation, no grand pronouncement. It was an understanding that grew organically, like a desert flower after a rare rain. She worked alongside Elias, her initial timidity giving way to a quiet competence. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the language of the wind, the feel of the earth beneath her hands. She mended clothes, tended a small herb garden she coaxed from the stubborn soil near the cabin, her touch bringing forth sprigs of green life. The harshness of the landscape began to soften, or perhaps it was her perception that changed. She saw beauty in the stark sunsets, solace in the vast, star-dusted night sky. The cabin, once a symbol of confinement during the storm, became a haven. The boots Elias had given her were now comfortably worn, mold to her feet, a testament to her journey. One cool autumn evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias took out his whittling knife and a piece of scrap wood. He worked silently, the shavings falling like soft snow. When he was done, he handed her a small, intricately carved wildflower, its petals delicate, its form capturing the fragile beauty of the prairie rose she kept pressed in her satchel. She took it, her fingers tracing its smooth lines. It was more than a gift, it was an acceptance, a symbol of her new life, her new beginning. Later, she saw him by the cabin door, his knife out again. He was carefully carving something into the weathered wood of the door frame. When he stepped back, she saw it, a small, stylized L, intertwined with a subtle D. Not a brand of ownership, but a quiet declaration of belonging, of a home found, of a family forged not by blood, but by shared hardship and resilient hope. She walked over to him, standing beside him, looking out at the land that stretched before them, no longer a place of fear, but of promise. The wind still whispered, but now it carried not threats, but the scent of wood smoke, of earth, and of peace. She had no husband, but she had a protector. She had a name, Lily, spoken with respect. And she had a home, built on courage and kindness. The silent rancher, a man of few words, had loved her in the only way he knew how, with steadfastness, with honor, and with a depth that healed them both. What truly defines a home? Is it the walls that shelter us, or the connections that sustain us? And when everything is lost, what does it take to reclaim not just a life, but a name, a future, and the very essence of who we are? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If Lily and Elias's story of resilience and unexpected love touched your heart, please subscribe for more tales of courage, connection, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Click here to watch our next film, where new journeys await.